So now I'm turning it over to you, the audience, to ask some questions. You get to catch them off guard now. They're unpracticed. So let's have at it. Nancy. And let me remind you to please introduce yourself and say your name when you first ask a question.
Nancy Knowlton, Smithsonian. So you all have done a really good job of sort of describing how much better the planet would be if we did all these things. What I was hoping to hear from you now is to give us some specific granular examples of places that have actually started to move down that path and how they achieved that success.
So we've been working in a number of the Nature Conservancy in a number of large countries, and what I've been struck by recently is we did a little side sort of work building the tools, essentially some of the accounting tools and conservation strategies we've developed in large countries like Indonesia and Brazil and Mexico. We've just sort of, some smaller countries have become aware of them, and we had a recent example in Gabon, the country of Gabon, where we were invited to go in and do a little calibration of this accounting tool for reduced impact logging, which can essentially avoid half of the emissions from logging activities in tropical forests without any reduction in the actual timber yield, so maintaining jobs, improving safety, et cetera, while delivering climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation. And in a matter of a year, Gabon has decided to essentially use this to deliver on between 50% and 100% of their NDC. This one, essentially, reduced impact logging method and accounting tool. And across all of their logging concessions, which are, I think, like more than half of their tropical forest. So, granted, it's an example of something that is about to happen and is starting to happen in specific concessions. But I think that kind of change, looking for those places that aren't always just like the big countries that we always hear about, but those specific examples of opportunities where the timing is right and they can demonstrate that.
A couple examples from agriculture are sustainable intensification, where there was a nice paper by Jules Pretty and colleagues in Nature Sustainability back in the summer, looking at where redesign of agriculture has gone through a system redesign threshold. They've added up all of the different looked at where the sustainable intensification has happened in the world, and looked at how many millions of hectares that affects, and how many rural livelihoods have been improved. So that's not a single practice. That has been driven by sort of individual government actions to improve things, but when you look at it globally, you can see that there's significant action in that. Another one is the soil carbon sequestration comes out as an option here, which works across a range of ecosystems and is good for food security because it increases production, and you don't need to change the land use. So, you don't lose any land that you would otherwise be growing food on. And the 4 per mil, I think, that's an initiative that was set up by the French government coming out of the Paris Agreement. 40 countries have now signed up to that to start things moving. So that's a bit further behind the sustainable intensification one, but the policy is now in place in 40 plus countries to start moving forward on that and to start getting philanthropic money as well as government money in to start things moving, removing some of those barriers. The thing is, if these things are so great, why aren't we doing them already? And the reason is because there are barriers, and it's usually dismantling those barriers, many of which are to do with governance and institutions and non-biophysical stuff. But that's starting to happen, so I'm optimistic.
I'll just add a cautionary note. There are limits to nature-based solutions as well, and one of them, which we talked about a lot, is coral reefs. And if you talk to, the president of a tropical, low-lying atoll nation, and say, look, if you manage your reefs wonderfully, everything will be all right, and you won't wash away, then you're probably lying to them. And even a really healthy reef has only probably an evens chance of keeping up with the rate of sea level rise that we are likely to experience in the next century. And the reef that is stressed by even a few of the stresses that we are exposing them to is unlikely to keep up with sea level rise. So we are going to have to see engineering solutions too, and the kind of mix of nature-based and hard fortress protection if countries like the Maldives are going to remain viable in the next 50 to 70 years.
Sandra.
Yeah, thank you. Sandra Diaz. Concerning the capacity of or the potential of restoration or reforestation as a climate mitigation option, I guess the results shown there are related to the ecological capacity of those areas to carry forests, right? If that is the case, I wonder whether there is any ongoing initiative to look at in whose land that has to happen, because it's a massive amount of land that might be ecologically suitable. Now, whose land is it? What are the tenure situation of the land? Is a big issue when it comes to equality. I'm not talking about countries, I'm talking within countries. I wanted to ask whether there is any intention to look at that.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. So for the analysis that I just presented, what we did do is we constrained by food security, which means we had a relatively optimistic scenario for the supply side, and basically that we assume sort of diet change and intensification such that a static footprint of agriculture would deliver for a growing human population. And that was so that constrained that analysis. So that was all reforestation that would happen outside of that essentially crop. Now, the big piece that we left in play were grazing lands, which deliver, I think, 5% of food calories with I think 70% of ag land. So it's it's a very inefficient production system when you're talking about grazing within forest ecoregions. So that was the piece that we left on the table as an opportunity, essentially as a trade-off with food, because it was sort of essentially a relatively luxury sort of side of the food equation. Having said that, it only eliminated about a third of the potential there. I have my own. So then the question is, well, what's all this other land? Which is to your point, right? Where is this land? And I think my suspicion is that so there's this notion of all this land is kind of degraded and nobody's using it and you can reforest. But the places I've been, I rarely ever see that land. Most of that land probably is being used. And my suspicion is that I do think for reforestation, there are a lot of difficult trade-offs that that are easy to sort of brush aside just looking at global data sets. So I would just say that I think that where I tend to be kind of drawn to is that very low production grazing lands I think are probably the best, at a large scale the best option, right? You look at sort of in Amazon and other places where you have really low food production by one head of cattle per couple hectares, and those could be great opportunities. Now, setting aside all the social and cultural issues, which are huge and I can't even speak to. But I would also say that other things like trees and croplands, an example, how can you build in trees into agricultural systems, whether it's silvopastoral agroforestry, those I think are particularly exciting opportunities because we can add carbon to systems without reducing yields. In many cases, increasing yields, which gets to soil carbon. So that those spaces where you're actually maintaining or increasing yields and adding carbon and biodiversity, to me, is the sweet spot and the near term.
Steve.
Steve Columbia, Stanford. A question about urban reforestation that both Sarah and Bronson talked about, because it seems like something that has great benefits that Sarah talked about. But I'm not sure that I understood your point, Bronson. Were you saying that if the United States reforested its cities, it would essentially account for all of the carbon that we need to mitigate? That's what I thought I heard, but that really can't be true. So what did you say?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, sorry if I confused things. No, all I meant to say was that we added one additional bar. It was actually a very small bar, which was urban reforestation, because in the U.S. context, the extent of urban or suburban landscapes is actually pretty large, despite it being a minority, cover type. And so it was large enough that it came on our radar screen in like a U.S. context, even though it did not come on our radar screen in the global context. So it's relatively small for that U.S. bar chart. It didn't even register for the global one. But bringing in more trees. That one piece of the so I would say at a regional level where you have a lot of kind of urban suburban context, like it can get on the map. And I think it's certainly a very good example of where the mitigation side of the story is unlikely to be a driver there, right? As we're talking about high value lands with all kinds of other benefits that are probably much more valuable in terms of a return on investment perspective. But
yeah, great. Thank you for clarifying that. It just
Yeah,
didn't make
I
any
would
sense
just
the other way.
add, we've done some analyses like just in the Twin Cities, and it's just a couple of % of the carbon emissions that can be offset by increasing forest cover. So, but I think that the cooling effects, so the mitigation of the urban heat island, and the reduction in energy use because of that, well, depending on where you are, if your cooling effects outweigh your reduced heating, anyway, are going to be more important than the carbon emission effects.
And sorry, just one last clarification is that point about. The point I was making about the U.S. study is that if you add up all of the pathways across all those different options, forests, agricultural, wetlands, that could deliver the U.S. NDC, which of course should be a higher NDC, but that was the point, not that any one of those pathways could deliver.
So it's all of it together. That's
yes.
Good.
Yeah. All the way in the back.
Thank you very much. My question's to Sarah. It's about more than 1 billion people worldwide who live in urban informal settlements, where the risk profile from climate would often be rather different, with obviously heightened vulnerability to storms, to landslides, often fatal consequences, and so on. I was just wondering what the thinking is about how priorities might be different for nature-based solutions in informal settlements worldwide.
Yeah, I think this maybe gets to the point that was raised earlier about there's only so much that nature-based solutions can do. And if you're talking about informal settlements or even developing cities that lack basic infrastructure, I think nature-based solutions can work in conjunction with non-nature-based solutions, gray infrastructure. But I think we have to take care of those basic needs first. Even sanitary sewer systems and the like, that we can't replace. It just doesn't scale, and we can't replace those kinds of engineered solutions with nature-based solutions in a lot of instances. So, Nancy might have more to say. Nancy, I'm sure, has more to say about that because she's been working across a range of developing to developed cities. But
I agree with you that the nature-based solutions are definitely not a panacea, but neither is building out massive gray infrastructure in a centralized way in the developing world. I think the solutions are probably much more distributed and may involve some elements of gray and some element of green, and that probably is a better approach. Can I ask my question now since I'm talking? Nancy Grimm. I was just going to say that since we're talking about opportunities, and one of the things since the subject of cities has come up, one of the opportunities is the opportunity for the transformation of people's values and views about what we do about climate change, because first of all, look at cities as kind of the place that's demanding all these resources from other places, as well as some of the places that are actually, at least in the developed world, producing a lot of the CO2 that is increasing in the atmosphere. Yet, at the same time, cities are working really hard. Some examples that Nancy was asking about earlier can be provided in cities that are actually getting together and working really hard on some potential solutions, adaptation solutions. And so I think given that a large proportion of our population, certainly in the developed world, 80%, but in the world as a whole, over 50% of the population is living in cities, it seems like it's a really great opportunity to bring those communities together around what needs to be done to really transform cities and the place that they live, which can affect not just the local experience of climate change, but also the broader systems that cities are dependent on.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I thought Rebecca's point about education was really important. And everything about cities is going to exacerbate the impacts of climate change. They're going to be hotter. They're going to be more prone to disturbance, destruction. And so that's how the most people are going to experience the effects of climate change. And I think that, it's going to become real to them through what they experience in urban environments. So I completely agree with you.
But the other positive opportunity is that because they are experiencing those and because that is such a focal point for climate change, that it may be the seed for
exactly. That's what my implication was. Yeah.
Chris Field, I want to make a comment and ask a question about framing. All of you spoke to the potential importance of natural climate solutions as sources of decreased emissions or even CO2 uptake. But a lot of the framing is in the context of, and maybe that allows us to delay action on energy and industry emissions. The theme that I really wanted to make in my talk is how little space we have for cumulative emissions. And I struggle with this, the way to frame the narrative that there's a tremendous potential in a nature-based solution, but that potential isn't in delaying action on energy and industry. Somehow we've got to transition to a sort of a yes and approach so that we can make the case that even though they're great opportunities, they can't take away the pressure from decreasing emissions in energy and industry.
Yeah, totally. So I've gone on a bit of a personal journey with this as well, with the sort of the moral jeopardy issue, and thinking that we shouldn't do that because it may delay us taking aggressive and immediate mitigation action. I think we're now in the position where we have to do immediate and aggressive and mitigation action plus. So about a year ago, I was thinking that we could maybe kick bioenergy with carbon capture and storage into the long grass because it's too difficult. It's got too many trade-offs, too many negative things. Particularly when the nature-based solutions paper was published, it looked like, okay, we can get a fair amount of mitigation with this one. So we can kick some of those more difficult and more challenging technologically negative emission technologies, we can kick them into the long grass for a while. But looking at where we are now and where we need to be, I think we probably need both. So I'm now, definitely, we definitely have to say this is additional. Immediate and aggressive mitigation action is non-negotiable, but we might still need some more.
I completely agree. Yeah, I just want to absolutely agree with both points and to emphasize that, this is something we struggle with, at the Nature Conservancy is, absolutely this is not an alternative. So the point about the U.S., finding we could deliver, of course we wouldn't deliver all of our NDC based, with land-based, but it's simply to say, hey, it's a big player, and to point out, so one of the things we point out is that something like 2% of the financing for climate mitigation goes to land-based options, which can deliver well over, an order of magnitude larger part of the solution. So the point is that there is a dramatically disproportionate investment in the land-based in proportion to the size of its solution. But having said that by no means should we, we have to be pedal to the metal on all of the options, whether it's, artificial sequestration, reducing fossil fuel emissions. So, and I think the news we keep hearing and essentially realizing that we've been very conservative in the climate community about our predictions because lots of things are getting worse faster, I think, than we predicted. So I think I guess, tragically, the bad news, the one good thing about the bad news is that I think it's easier to argue we need all of those things.
Bhas Kavira from Cambridge. This possibly is returning us to the question that Sandra was asking slightly earlier. And I think Sarah made this point in her presentation around trying to think about how the costs and benefits are being distributed and the questions around equity. And I think while opportunities are hugely important, very few of them come without opportunity costs. And I think being transparent about trade-offs is probably really helpful rather than searching for those kind of very elusive multiple wins, because I think in practice there are usually some trade-offs. But actually we can be transparent. I feel trying to hide behind the language of win-win is probably less preferable than saying, here are the trade-offs. And actually society would prefer a state of the world in which the wins outweighed some of the losses. Now, hearing about the dynamism of the ecosystem in the morning sessions, the end state of the world that we might arrive at is going to look very different to what we've experienced in the past. But we need to be transparent about saying this is a desirable end state, and for certain people and for certain places. So that's where the distributional question and the equity questions might also be important. So it's not just trade-offs between people, but it's also trade-offs between management objectives just in an ecosystem functioning sense, because the new ecosystems are going to look quite different, we hear, from the old ones. And maybe just being transparent about that is helpful, because in practice I find the win-wins are minimal. I mean, there are some. It's great when they're there. But actually in practice there's going to be some opportunity cost. So let's talk about those more transparently.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, when we talk about trade-offs and co-benefits, we sometimes forget that those are experienced by real people. So those social justice and equity issues have to be at the forefront. I mean, some of the good thing about looking in this IPCC chapter, looking at the integration across all of them, is when we look at some of those, we look at securing land tenure and prevention of land grabbing, some of those things which you do, which are actually proposed as, adaptation measures to make it better for sustainable rural livelihoods, they also have co-benefits in the others. So actually a lot of these I wouldn't frame in terms of climate as the main thing. I would say that that's a co-benefit for something else. And I think we can find some of those sweet spots, but they have different winners and losers in different parts of the world. It's a good point.
So on the broad scale, I absolutely agree with you, but I do want to point out that I think there are a number of those options which definitely have major trade-offs, and they particularly tends to be the case where there are land use changes required. So reforestation is a good example, where it's the largest opportunity, but it is a fundamental change in the use of that land, which is clearly going to affect people in specific places. So, but there are a lot of those options, I would point out, that are actually really technical, essentially just professionalizing the business model, for which there's a cost at the front end. There's an investment to buy a better machine to micro-distribute nutrients to the croplands, but then there is a net win-win. I would argue for a number of those. There's actually, like, everybody wins if you can make that upfront cost, which then you make back. So you know what I'm saying. So whereas I agree that there's never, or very rarely is there a complete, like, a gross win-win, in the sense that you never have to do anything up front, because you always do, to get over a barrier. But there are a number of those for which there is actually, I do believe sincerely, like, we're doing cover crops in the Midwest with farmers, and basically once we explain to them the benefits for their production of their yield of crops, that's the fertility of the soil by increasing the carbon, it's taken off like wildfire. Like, they're doing it. There's another example of a specific, and same thing with the reduced impact logging. I mean, that there's really, at the end of the day, there's no downside to it aside from an upfront investment for many of them, but not all of them.
Nat Seddon, Oxford. I was going to save this for tomorrow, but as I've got you all of you in front of me now, it's really wanted to get your idea about financing nature-based solutions. Cristina Fiegas in a talk last week in Oxford said that nature-based solutions went on the exponential climate solutions curve because nature-based solutions were deploringly undercapitalized, were her words. And it's like, what are the realistic ways do you think, really, of really scaling up nature-based solutions and dealing with, how do we mobilize all the climate finance so that they support those at the local and the regional and international level? What are the obstacles to that, and how are we going to get around that? Because that strikes me as being like the fundamental issue here.
So I was just actually writing a note to myself about Nancy's valley of death, and the difficulty of knowing where we are, knowing where we want to be, and there's a cost in getting to where we want to be, and often that cost is relatively low. But if if people don't have much money, then they're not going to be able to afford it and to make that jump. So I think from the point of view of creating marine protected areas, for example, there's a very strong case to be made for investing in those as climate offsets to some degree, and investing some of that money in reducing the conversion to fish farms, or taking people off fishing an area, replacing the lost income that they're going to have while the system kicks into a more productive mode. And those sources of income just haven't been available up to now. And if by bringing the narratives together that doing this is good for climate change mitigation, as well as for all these other sorts of societal reasons why you might want to have a healthy ecosystem and environment, then that might free up some more in the way of resources that we need to be able to spend on it. But at the moment, I'm not seeing that happening very much. I mean, in the Seychelles, for example, there has been a kind of debt for nature swap, so there's more conservation going on there, and hopefully that will start to rebuild some of the losses in the Seychelles, which have been climate related and fairly severe. But there's much more needed.
I think there are lots of different mechanisms. I think so. In the last year, there are people saying, so what are we going to do with this? People who've got philanthropic money, largely in the US, who have people who are wanting to invest their money in something that is safe and non-reversible and is going to give a real climate benefit. So I don't know what size that is. I don't know what size of that money is. I said it's probably billions, it's not trillions, and it's trillions that's needed. But there are other examples. For example, Scotland has a woodland expansion programme and also a peatland restoration programme, which is partly to do with just creating a better environment, but is also partly to do with meeting its climate change targets, which it has under legislation. So the state is putting some money in there. It's operating it through Scottish Natural Heritage, which is actually putting real money into doing real peatland restoration. So I think there's a whole bunch of different ways that the finance could come in. It is chronically underfunded, totally. I wondered if more sort of corporate responsibility on the voluntary carbon market could help. I'm not an expert on that. I only know the words to say. But if the people who do know how to access this funding and how to sell it, that's it's difficult because some of these things they're synced, so they're reversible, they saturate, they're difficult to monitor and verify. So we've got a whole bunch of different problems associated with these nature-based solutions that you don't have if you invest in my direct air capture machine, I can capture things from the air. So we're up against sort of tough, if it is competition, it doesn't have to be, but we're up against some other technologies where we have a bunch of problems that we need to overcome. And the science community can help to do that, I think, particularly on the monitoring and reporting and verification.
So just to, I think, build on that very quickly is that I think that, if with that set of those 20 options, which are not necessarily the best way of sort of carving up the world, but let's just say we go with that. Some of them I think are fundamentally like government policy issues. So avoided deforestation is a good example. Like you can't really deal with that at a small scale. It's not it's kind of, I don't think of it as sort of an investment strategy as much as like a decision that to deal with sort of trade-offs and for the greater good, and anyway, so sort of basically policy solutions that aren't necessarily financial, and you see that the success Brazil had that was basically a policy solution, 5 years ago. Then there are other categories of those that I think they're like investment, impact capital that you structure, I don't know, certain types of investment funds around. There's a machine that reduces, the logging impacts with a long line winching cable system, that there's a machine to distribute the nutrients. There's things like that, which are really private sector investment sort of, structures that need to be built that would be linked with maybe some kind of incentives from the government, something like that. And then, anyway, I guess depending upon the action of those long lists, they're quite different, I think, types of sort of stakeholders involved and investment structures around them.
So I believe we've now come to time for our break. Are there any announcements before people go?
One announcement is that please head up blinking in the sunlight. We'll take a group photo before you come and have your coffee.
So please say thank you again to our panelists.